Hello everybody, my name is Shawn Hendriks and I'm here to take you through a class that I did just recently, a 90-minute class on animating creation. Now the idea behind this class was to give people tips, tricks, techniques on how to use 3ds Max to animate the creation or exposure of objects. When I talk about this, one of the examples would be like transformer type animation where objects are flipping out of each other and building themselves into something new. You see it a lot in car commercials. The other style I wanted to do though was a more organic version of creation. So in the organic version you actually have things growing up in kind of curves and billows and folds, and instead of this very mechanical flipping. You can see here the image of the Golden Gate Bridge, which will be our second project, a piece of it kind of growing up like a fiddlehead fern out of the water. Now through this session what I'm going to do is look at some very basic techniques both for modeling and animating, as well as some little controller tricks and things like that. But also we're going to take a look at some basic scripting so that you get an idea of how you can use scripts to automate some of the things that I'll be doing here in this class. So why don't we just jump right in. In this first video what I'm going to do is look at just kind of the planning process for the whole thing. So here you can see the overall look at this presentation. First thing I want to do is plan out our animation. Figure out what we're going to do before we dive into doing anything else. Before you commit yourself to any models or anything else, ideally you would start planning the animation. Now, in this particular case, I already had a model made from an earlier project that I thought, well, I might as well use this as my starting basis for the scene. So here we've got what's called the Yeti microphone from Blue. That's what I'm using to record my voice right now. And what I'm going to do is animate this in a couple different ways. I'm looking at doing having the barrel of the microphone actually telescope up both bottom and top, and then holes appear and have the buttons pop out. And I'm looking at having the base basically flip up one little card at a time until it builds itself. So that's my basic plan. Now, as I said, you're not supposed to start with modeling or anything else up front, but in the case of something like this, many times when you're doing this animation, someone will already be providing you with models. So if you're doing a car animation version of this, someone will probably already be providing you with the car model. So it's not so unusual for, in these types of animation, to at least have a basic model starting point. Although, mental note, there's a good chance you'll have to remodel parts of it to try and do the effects that you choose to do. Now once you've examined the scene and thought of what you're going to do, now it's testing. And testing is incredibly important. You want to make sure that you try all the effects you think you're going to do, figure out how you're going to do them and whether they're going to work and at what complexity level. So first thing you do when I get into these effects is, can I script it? Once I've figured out what effect I'm going to do and I see how complicated it is, my first assessment is how many steps am I going to do and how repetitive are those steps going to be. If it's something where I'm going to do the same thing 1,000 times, I want to script that sucker. If, on the other hand, it's something, oh, I'm only going to do it 10 or 12 times and it's very artistic, kind of choosing where it's going to be at any given point, then I'm probably going to do it by hand. Typically, projects like this are going to end up being a mix of both. Now, one of the things that people don't really think about when they're testing is they'll test this effect, they'll test that effect. They won't necessarily test the two effects together. And I found many times in my history with 3D animation is the two effects will work perfectly in their own scenes, and then something about the way they interact with each other in a 3D scene doesn't mean they don't necessarily work, but new things pop up, new problems that you didn't foresee that may change the way you have to do the entire scene. So always try your effects together. Typically when I do testing, I actually start testing on just very simple box primitives, something that can represent what I'm going to do. I never start on the more complex geometry. I want to really focus in on just the fundamentals of how I do what I do. So if it's something where it's a flipping animation with 300 objects, I'll do a flipping animation with 5, and they'll just be boxes first to make sure it works. It's easy to scale up from there. Once I've got that down, now I start blocking up my shots. I try and, for all intents and purposes, the storyboarding portion of this process. This is when I figure out where are my cameras going to be and how are they going to move through the shot. This can be relatively loose many times, but you want to know what you're going to see because there's no point in animating stuff you're never going to see. So for instance, here you can see I've got 3 different camera moves I've designed, and the thing to note is that this knob here, when it pops out of the microphone, I don't see the knob on the other side, which is this one over here. So there's no point in me animating this knob up here. I can just turn it on at some point when the camera comes around far enough to see it. So it saves me a little bit of animation time. If I didn't know what my camera shots were going to be, I wouldn't know that, and therefore I'd waste time animating. Last but not least, you got to think about organization. The two shots that I'm doing here, particularly the microphone, aren't particularly complicated. I didn't want to go overboard and really do these hugely difficult, complicated scenes for a class. But when you do this kind of animation, it can get very, very complicated, very, very quick. Thousands and thousands of objects, all with thousands of keyframes, all in different pieces with different techniques. You can bury yourself very fast. Organization is important. So first thing you want to know is, how will you structure your files? What are your naming conventions going to be? How are you going to control the complexity in the scene? So this might all be about layers. This may be selection sets. It's hard to say what you're going to choose depending on the type of scene. But how do you control that complexity and density? Well, like I say, you could use layers and selection sets, but the problem there is often all that complexity and density is still actually in the file. You still got these monster files. So what I like to use is X references, scene X references, things like that, to try and control how much is in the file at any one time. Because if you put something in an X ref and you turn it off, it literally evacuates it from the scene, so it's not taking memory, so your scene can be that much faster. So just mental notes, things to think about when you're working. So at this point, why don't we just get on with it and jump into the first scene. Okay, so looking at animating creation, let's start out with the very first model I want to work with, which is the microphone. This is the Yeti microphone that I've got on my desk here. And I'll start off just showing you an end result. And again, I kept this fairly basic, straightforward. I didn't worry about a lot of rendering or materials or any of that stuff. This was all about just some animation principles here. So if I just shuttle my time slider along, you can actually see how everything creates itself. And if you look in the camera viewport, you can see a rough idea of my camera perspectives. So I've actually have the camera follow the creation up, see that knob create, and then I have it pop out and see everything else happening. Now if you want to see the overall creation here, just look in the front viewport, and I'll just blow this up to full view so you can see it better. So again, everything flips up, knobs, and then the cylinder grows and it's all done. So that's going to be the basic model that we're going to create. Now, so this is a finished scene, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to load in my starting point and give you an idea first of how I set up my file management for this particular scene. So here you notice I've got my full model, everything's all set up. One of the things you will note is if I take my knobs and move them around, there's no hole there. I've actually left the Boolean objects I'm going to use to cut holes into the cylinder separate. This way I can actually add the holes later after I've cut up my model the way I want to, and I'll still have animation control over them. So first thing I want to do is set up some file management. Now basically what I'm going to do is break this model up into the logical components that represent the different techniques I'm going to use. So to do that, I can go through and just select basically the barrel of the microphone, that piece right there. We'll grab the little knob. And so that's everything plus the Boolean objects that's required to do the animation of just the barrel. And what I'll do is I'll go up here and go to References and XREF Scene. And what I can say is I want to convert all the selected objects into an XREF scene. So I'm going to call this Test Top and hit Save and say yes. So the beauty of this is now I've XREF'd out all of those components. Now you're going, well, if you have never worked with XREFs, you may be wondering what that means. Well, what it means is, for all intents and purposes, those objects aren't really in the scene anymore. You're seeing them, but I don't have any access to them. I have to go out to that other file to work on them. And the beauty of this is, anytime I want to make things faster in this scene, I can simply click on that object and disable it, and now all those components are truly gone from the scene. They're just not there anymore. So now once I've made that go away, I can go and select all these pieces and call that the base, and I can say I want to convert that to selected, and we'll call that test base. Hit save, yes. So now that's been XREF'd out, and again, this can be easily turned on or off. I can turn this back on and bring it back in, and now everything's in the scene, but nothing is selectable because none of it exists here in this scene. You can also bind your objects to a local object, so if I actually want to be able to control placement of this, I can just throw a helper or a dummy object to my scene and bind my scene XREF to that. Now you may be wondering why I'm doing a scene XREF as opposed to an object XREF. Well, the scene XREF will allow me to take into account the changing number of objects in the XREF. So for instance, when I take this cylinder out into the other scene, I'm going to cut it into 6 or 7 separate pieces with separate names. And the scene XREF will see all those new objects and bring them in automatically, whereas if it was an object XREF, it wouldn't notice new objects because it's only paying attention to things at the object level. So that's basically why I'm doing it that way. So once you've done all this, now you're ready to move on and start figuring out how to animate the overall scene.